edition of How Can I Help? Saving Nature with Your Own Yard by Doug Tallamy. And as I had said before, when we kind of advertised this session, you could read the book if you wanted to. If you didn't want to read the book or didn't know about it, that's also fine too. This is not a situation in which you had to read the book and I'm going to be quizzing you on it. This is me having read the book and going through and sharing with you some of the highlights that I think most readers would get something out of or find some use in. And today we are very lucky to talk about this book and get to have some input from experts as well. So I wanted to share that in this book review, we're going to present some of the questions and answers that Tallamy shared in his book. And we're going to get expert insights from our special guest, UGA conservation horticulturist Heather Alley. Heather is the conservation horticulturist at the Mimsie Lanier Center for Native Plant Studies at the State Botanical Garden of Georgia. She specializes in native grasses and perennials for habitat restoration, pollinator conservation, residential landscaping, and endangered plants for conservation. And she enjoys teaching and lecturing, and she's the author of Guide to Propagation and Characteristics of Favorite Georgia Natives, 30 Perennials for Pollinators. So as you can see, anytime we do anything in Extension, it's all about educating, and we like to not just take what's out in kind of the pop culture, we want to get the UGA and the science-backed perspective as well. And so I also want to take this opportunity to plug my upcoming Houseplant Academies, September, October, November, December. I'll be recycling a couple of the ones I did last year, but they won't be the exact same as what I presented last year. They will be basically that presentation and kind of bumped up. So if you're interested in registering or attending virtually or in person, either one is great. Just register at the Gwinnett Extension website. We'd love to have you. Okay, so let's get into the meat of this book. And everybody, as you're coming in, I know people will still trickle in. Please mute yourselves as you go. And then if you have a question, please enter it in the chat and we'll get to it at the end. Okay, so who is Doug Tallamy and what is this book about? And as I was kind of discussing with some of the guests here in person as we were setting up, Doug Tallamy is a professor in the Department of Entomology, which is insects, if you didn't know that. I'm sure a lot of you probably do, but maybe not everyone. Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he's authored 107 research publications and taught insect-related courses for 44 years. He's the best-selling author of Bringing Nature Home, which is really how I came to know about him. I think a lot of people did with Bringing Nature Home. Nature's Best Hope, The Nature of Oaks, and he's the co-founder of Homegrown National Park. In this book, he provides 499 questions and answers to help homeowners take the next steps to save nature in their own yards. I think this is really an important book of his. If you read anything, you probably would want to read this one if you're not into reading all the different books, because he basically has compiled all the questions he still received from his books and his lectures from basically homeowners like you who want to know a little bit more about what this is and how to get into it. So what was Tallamy's goal in writing this book? What is the important takeaway? So in the introduction, he writes that residential landowners and homeowners hold enormous conservation potential because there are so many of them and they control the plantings on landscapes over such large areas of the country. And this is really true because if you think about it, we have our nature preserves, we have our parks, but most of the landscape is taken up with all of us with our homes and yards and businesses. He goes on to say that 135 million acres of the U.S. are now in residential landscapes. And he posits that with a little education, we can all come to realize that sustainable earth stewardship is not something we can ignore or practice only if we feel like it, or something that happens only in natural areas. And so that was a really important takeaway for me as well. And finally, that caring for the life around us is a responsibility that we all hold. So I featured a picture here that's kind of a typical suburban lawn. Okay, let's go. Okay, why does Tallamy want us to plant native plants in our gardens? And he says it all goes back to this idea that we're separate from nature. Some people think nature is nice, we like it, but we don't need it. And I thought this was a really good quote from him as well, because I love nature. I love plants. I'm an animal lover too. Not everybody is. We all know people who they don't really like to grow or garden, or they may not really like animals. But he's making the point that even if we're not into those things, we still all require it. We still all need this functional food web. We all depend on it. And so how are we as humans dependent on, insects and animals in the environment? And he says, Plants are capturing energy from the sun and they're turning it into food, the simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. If you don't get that food to animals, you don't have any animals. And if you don't have any animals, you don't have a functional ecosystem. And if you don't have a functional ecosystem, you don't have humans. So that's the connection. Ecosystems provide the life support that keeps us alive on this planet. So now we're kind of aware of the fact that not only is gardening or working with plants something that we do for fun or relaxation or for beautification, but it's something that we all, have to take some responsibility for because apparently our lives depend on it. New way of looking at gardening. And he says, what's happening in our parks and preserves is not enough. We need functional ecosystems everywhere, and that means sharing our spaces with nature, our human-dominated spaces. The most important creature in terms of taking energy from the plant to other animals is caterpillars. This was surprising to me because I know caterpillars are cute, they're important. I didn't realize they played such a pivotal role in the environment. He says they're transferring more energy to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So it's a long way of saying if you make a landscape that doesn't have enough caterpillars in it, you're going to have a failed food web and eventually a failed ecosystem. Now, I know not everybody here lives in Gwinnett, probably a lot of you do, but just using Gwinnett as an example, I know where I live in Sewanee, it's just constant new construction, habitat being torn down to build new homes because people are moving to Georgia just in droves. The population is increasing like crazy all the time, and if you don't believe it, just check out the traffic. So when you think about that and you kind of put it into your own immediate worldview of all these natural spaces being demolished or torn down, and then you have all these homes coming up and then yards and they're being sprayed with chemicals and they're just basically lawns with a few shrubs, you think, well, gosh, that really could have a huge impact on our food web. So the importance of caterpillars. Tallamy says this is the main message of his book because so many animals rely on them for food. So caterpillars, particularly those of moths, are often referred to as the bread and butter of terrestrial food webs. They're most important in temperate ecosystems like ours. So we don't have fruits that are just, ripe year round. We don't live in a tropical environment. We don't have fruits you can just go out and get at any time of the year. So they're very important in a place like where we are. Caterpillars transfer more energy from plants to higher trophic levels than any other herbivore. And this was a really surprising fact to me. Foraging grizzly bears can eat 40,000 army cutworm adults every day in early fall, and those moths contribute substantially to the bear's overwintering fat reserves. So when I think of a foraging grizzly bear, I'm thinking of it eating like all kinds of, heavy fat items, meat, being predatory, but it needs 40,000 army cutworms a day in early fall. So that just shows the importance of this to our ecosystem. Caterpillars dominate nestling diets, and it takes many thousands to bring a clutch of birds to independence. And I just had, fortunately/unfortunately, had a bird raise two sets of little baby birds on my porch. Fortunately, because it was cute. Unfortunately, because it was a huge mess, as you can imagine. But, that mom was constantly bringing food to those babies. It was just every time you looked out there, she was bringing something. And these mama birds have to be able to go out and find these insects in the environment. And if they're just a barren lawn with, just a couple of shrubs, it's not going to happen. So ornithologist Richard Brewer recorded Carolina chickadee parents bringing 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to their nestlings, depending on the amount of chicks. And the largest insect order is Hymenoptera, consists of bees, wasps, and ants, and it contains 700,000 species that live off caterpillars. So that's quite a bit, quite a big importance. So, I've gotten the privilege of attending some pollinator symposiums and just some master gardener conferences and different types of venues in which people come and present and they talk about gardening, ornamental gardening or native gardening or whatever. And you hear a lot of discussion and sometimes, dare I say, pushback against native plants because, we've been told for a while now that native plants are so important and we should be planting natives and not exotics. And there are some questions, is this really as important or as dire as we think it might be? So a question that Tallamy receives a lot is why can't insects adapt to imported plants that have been here for hundreds of years? Studies have shown rapid adaptation in Darwin's finches and fruit flies, so it seems possible. Okay, so he responds, this is one of the most important questions in the book. He says, first, there's no pressure for insects to adapt to a new host. So they really have no reason to be looking for a new host. They have good hosts already, and they look for those instead of trying to use new ones. Whereas Darwin's finches had no options. They had to eat those new seeds or die. He goes on to say that our insects don't know that we have removed most of their host plants, so they instinctively search for the chemical cues they have used for millions of years. So I have up here, clockwise from left, the sulfur butterfly on a native partridge pea. We have the zebra swallowtail. He'll only lay his eggs on native pawpaw. And a rose mallow bee is a specialist on hibiscus. So some of these different insects will only lay their eggs on certain native species. We see them flying around some popular plants of ours, but that doesn't mean they're significant for reproduction. He says there's a second reason that it's so difficult for insects to adapt to new host plants, and it's the number of genetic changes that would be required to do so. And this is something that, me as a non-entomologist would not have really thought through or thought of. But he says host plant specialization, which that just means there are certain insects that can only reproduce on certain plants, involves hundreds of genes, such as those which control when that adult female searches for her plants, what chemical cues from those plants she can recognize and pick up on, the surface waxes that will stimulate her to lay her eggs, whether the hatching caterpillars are stimulated to start eating the plant, and then the genes that enable the caterpillar to handle the chemical defense of the plant physiologically. And what that means is, as I read and kind of discovered, was that there are a lot of plants that if the insect tries to eat them, they'll die. They haven't developed the physiological or chemical defenses to surpass whatever that plant's defense system is. Things that I wouldn't have thought of. So he urges us to think of all the genes that would be necessary to do this. So the female has to recognize a new plant as a potential host. Then she has to lay her eggs. Then the larvae have to physiologically be able to eat that plant without dying, because unless it's one of their specialist plants, they probably would. And this has to be happening with enough individuals at once, so there would be a breeding population able to use the new plant. And he says the chances of this happening are slim to none, which is disappointing, but it kind of makes us understand why these native plants are so important. Why, this isn't something that we're just doing. It's not a dogma necessarily. This is something that's necessary to our society. And Tallamy cites the monarch butterfly's host relationship with black swallowwort as a good example of how those host switches are so difficult. Black swallowwort is not a plant I've ever seen in Georgia. It's apparently much more prevalent in the Northeast, I believe. It was introduced in the U.S. from Europe in 1853, and it's very nice looking, as you can see in those pictures. It's a perennial vine that's native to Europe. It can grow up to 6.5 feet in height. It forms those dense monocultures, which means it's just that one plant all over the place in sun or shade. And then it escaped residential gardens, and now it's an invasive species throughout much of New England. So black swallowwort apparently is a member of the milkweed family, and the sensors on the monarch's antennae, tarsi, ovipositor, recognize it as milkweed, which is a problem. This mistaken identity leads monarchs to mistake black swallowwort for their usual milkweed host and lay their eggs. So the defense chemistry is different from what is found in the genus Asclepias, which is milkweed, and monarchs do not have the enzymes they would need to detoxify it. So unfortunately, as Tallamy pointed out, every tiny hatchling that finds itself on that black swallowwort because its mother mistook it for a true milkweed starves to death. And even after 170 years of making this mistake, monarchs have still not developed their adaptations to be able to develop on the black swallowwort. So he's saying these host switches do happen in nature, but they are extraordinarily rare. And so I'd like to take this moment here. Heather, if you'd like to unmute yourself, and if you would have anything you'd like to weigh in on with the points I've made. She did?
We've lost Heather.
I'm back.
Oh, lovely.
I lost internet, but I got it back.
Lovely in the age of technology. Okay, so as you, with your work in native gardening and conservation, do you ever hear or get this kind of pushback from people about, well, why can't things just evolve to accept these different plants? Why is this so important? And what is your take on that?
No, I have not gotten that kind of pushback. I was kind of amazed reading the book, the kind of argumentative folks that Dr. Tallamy seems to have
Right.
run-ins with. So
I
no,
would imagine
I'm
that probably
surprised
you.
someone would argue with reality like that, really.
Right. I think probably you are mostly around people who are already native garden enthusiasts
Right.
and probably, they already have bought into the fact that yes, we need native plants. Yes, this is important. You don't have to convince us. But he probably encounters a lot of ornamental gardeners, which, I would count myself as one too before I learned really about native plants as well. That they just want to make a beautiful landscape. They don't want to be told that something they've been gardening with or the way they've been gardening is not good, or I think as a gardener, we hold a lot of pride or take a lot of pride in the fact that we are helping the environment. What we're doing is not just a hobby, but it's something that we're doing that's helping insects and bees and wildlife. And so to be told that maybe some of those things we have planted are not doing that, or to be
Mm.
told that, our lawns, which we have maintained by a landscape company and get sprayed, throughout the year, are actually doing the opposite. There's a little pushback to that. We don't want to hear that. We're doing something good. We're trying to make something beautiful, and you're here telling us no. So, I don't know. I think that's what I run into discussion of this quite a bit, I guess, because I'm not just strictly in the native plant space. But let's go on to the next question and we'll see. So, you claim it takes thousands of years, if ever, for insects to adapt to new host plants, but some other entomologists, and we said those are insect specialists, disagree and point to several species of butterflies that now breed successfully on non-native plants. How do you explain that? This is a question that Tallamy received. It's in the book. So he responds by pointing to the difference between host switching and host range expansion. In host switching, new adaptations have to happen for the insect to be able to, have its evolutionary changes and phytochemical defenses changes to encounter a new plant. But a host range expansion is just when an insect starts using a new host plant for which it already has developed the necessary adaptations. And so, in more layman's terms, host switching is basically when an evolutionary change does happen to make that insect able to eat that plant. And then the host range just means no evolutionary change had to happen. They were already able to eat that. So I kind of think of it like, we humans aren't used to necessarily eating dandelions all the time, but we're capable of eating dandelions, and dandelions are actually good for us, but we just don't normally eat them. So, think of it like that. They're very good for you, actually, but kind of as an example. He says the black swallowtail is a specialist on plants in the carrot family. So when we brought Queen Anne's lace, carrots, parsley, and dill to the U.S., the black swallowtail already had those adaptations it needed to use those plants. And then he says that even accounting for host range expansion, the vast majority of our native Lepidoptera, which is butterflies and moths, cannot use those plants. So that's something interesting to note. This was something that kind of hurt me, this outdoor lighting thing, because, and I have, I attended the pollinator symposium, and I know about outdoor light being a hindrance to plants and really the fireflies. So I'm from Missouri, and we called them lightning bugs. Apparently it's a regional thing. They were always lightning bugs. I was like, what's a firefly? So when I was a kid, I'm dating myself here, but lightning bugs were everywhere. You went out at a certain time of the evening and there were just lightning bugs all over the place, and it wasn't an issue. And now if you see a lightning bug or firefly, it's like, oh my gosh, there's one. And so he's talking about how light pollution is one of the major causes of this insect decline. Nearly everywhere, the night skies are lit up with white lights that emit those cool wavelengths. And those are precisely the wavelengths that most nocturnal insects are attracted to. Mortality is high for insects attracted to lights. Even if an insect escapes the dangers of artificial lights, it'll die of exhaustion from circling the light, starvation from circling the light, or being eaten by one of the many insect predators that dine on those insects near lights. So they can also be blinded by the bright light, which will bring them to an early death. So again, when I was a kid, besides the prevalence of lightning bugs and fireflies everywhere in the evening, is we always got a bug zapper, and we loved the bug zapper. Like my parents got the bug zapper. It was an exciting thing to put out in the back, and you'd hear it zzz, zzz, as it killed every single bug that was coming up to it. We didn't realize that we were probably killing all of the beneficial insects and not really getting those nasty ones that we don't want. So that's something that he pointed out. As he says, the light pollution disrupts insect circadian rhythms, triggers inappropriate egg laying, and keeps the attracted insects from doing what they have to do to reproduce, like forage, mate, and eventually reproduce. But he says, replace white lights with yellow bulbs, which emit warm light wavelengths and are far less attractive to nocturnal insects. And simply by switching to these types of bulbs, we can nearly eliminate this huge source of insect mortality. Something else he pointed out is that, bats and other animal and wildlife of prey that go to look for these insects, the insects aren't there when they need them because they're circling the lights. So, I saw this yellow light bulb and I thought, that's kind of going to be a hard sell because it's not too attractive, and we like outdoor lighting to look attractive. I like to turn on my outdoor lights. But I was happy to hear that he said it doesn't just have to be a yellow light, it can be an amber light. And amber lights are very nice looking. So it's just a different way of thinking of things, he points out the exhaustion, the collisions, dehydration, the increased predation, all these different problems with the outdoor lights, and how if we just do this one change with our lights, we can make such a difference. And I would love to see, lightning bugs / fireflies come back to life, or come back to being way more prevalent than like they were as a kid. As you can see in this picture, it's obviously not from my own backyard, but it's from Virginia Tech. But all these different lightning bugs everywhere, and we want to bring those good insects back. And he pointed out you can check out darksky.org and fireflieson.org. Look at those websites to learn more about this. And then we release tons of carbon into the atmosphere by using these lights. And so just simply out of habit. So we don't have to get rid of outdoor lights completely. We just have to make a smarter choice. And then this is not something that I did. It's from the Northeast Wildlife Team. But it talks about how, this light pollution does affect so many different parts of our life negatively. And you really, when you think about it, there aren't very many dark spaces anywhere. Like even a dark space is not fully dark. It interferes with the birds migrating. They become disoriented and crash into buildings. It affects humans. I know for me, I like to have a really dark room. I'll cover up that night light or that little clock so the light's not bothering me. It affects us and how our bodies react. Some insects use it to communicate with their mates, and so whenever you have this interference of outdoor lighting, the fireflies / lightning bugs, they don't know how to reproduce anymore because they can't communicate. It's being interrupted. Bats are missing their prey, and other animals. Just the light pollution often reduces their ability to get high quality sleep like we do. Honestly, never thought about that. Never thought about the fact that there's just wildlife out there in the different forest areas or wooded areas that required heavy duty sleep and that was being interrupted by these different lights. So turn off those outdoor lights when you aren't using them. You can angle your lights downward. You can replace them with amber colored lights, which are actually very nice looking. Close your curtains or blinds at night when you have lights on inside. Use those low to the ground pathways and use a timer so the lights turn off automatically. I have some neighbors, I won't say their names, but I'm sure they're not on this little webinar, but they have outdoor lights on, like those bright spotlight ones, just 24/7. Like the lights never go off, even in the daytime. And I just think, So if we cannot, and they probably don't even realize that it's a thing. Somebody flipped the switch on someday and never really noticed. It's on a part of the house they don't really go on, where like the air conditioner is. Just little things like this can make such a difference. So something else he talked about, it's quite an issue we have here in Gwinnett too. We have so many deer and they're running out of places to be, and they really exacerbate the invasive plant problem by eating native plants and not touching the invasives. And this is something I did not make this connection until I read about it in Tallamy's book. So he says the deer support huge populations of black-legged ticks, and they carry Lyme disease. And he mentioned he has had Lyme disease 5 times, which I didn't even know that was possible. Like I thought when you got Lyme disease, you just always had it, or it had you hear about people with long-term effects and they never get rid of it. But anyway, 5 times. It's pretty serious. And he makes the point that the deer ticks don't eat the native plants or the brush piles or the leaf litter that we're being told to get rid of. They eat blood, they mate on deer. Deer have almost eliminated the understories of many forests and woodlots, apart from the invasives. And so adding more mammals to your ecosystem, and he mentions like skunks, chipmunks, raccoons, squirrels, rabbits, woodchucks, foxes, is a way to help. But how do you do that? We're not going to necessarily bring these things back into our backyards. He's talking about deer and how we need to have dead-end hosts, which means different wildlife that will eat those deer ticks. And he says that in the South, because I never really thought about this until he made the point either, that I don't hear of a lot of Lyme disease. I never really hear of anybody around me or in my, in Georgia talking about getting Lyme disease. It's because we have these lizards. And this little lizard down here at the bottom, this little green guy, I have those all over my house, all over. The cats look out the window and chase them and, whatever. They're taking care of a lot of those issues. And so if you don't have lizards like that in your landscape because you're spraying too many chemicals or maybe they just, aren't adjusted to your climate, you're not going to have that protection. So he's a big advocate of taking control of the deer population, which is something maybe we gardeners can't necessarily do. But he makes a point also something about the fact that deer like native plants, not the non-natives. And so when they come in and they eat the native plants, it's not because those invasives just are better suited to our environment or they're doing better. It's because the deer are eating little baby oaks and little baby whatever that are coming up in these forests and green spaces. So okay, so here's another one. Why can't new non-native ornamental species be a better fit than our native flora? It has to do with the rate at which those new species are introduced. So it's too rapid. In 70 years, we've had 3,300 non-native species be introduced. Arrival of new species at our shores is natural. That's something that he says he hears a lot, and it's actually not true. So in the past, the arrival of new species occurred over millions of years at a glacial speed, which is very slow. And the arrival of new species now is too fast for those adaptations to happen. They're arriving thousands of times faster than native organisms can adapt to them. If you have a couple of species every million years or so, it gives those plant communities time to adapt. New species aren't more fit just because they outcompete. They've left their natural enemies behind, and the deer don't like them, like bush honeysuckle, burning bush, autumn olive. They're not superior plants for our environment. They just happen to be ones that our, predators don't want to eat. So this overabundance of deer makes these plants look like super plants. They don't like those autumn olive, porcelain berry, burning bush, but they love the baby oak tree and other natives. Makes them look like those are better suited, but they're not. They're not super plants. So that's something to think of too. When we see that wisteria that blooms every spring, it looks pretty until you realize how detrimental it is. Okay, so talking about HOAs and criticism of weeds. So this is something I live in a home that's in suburbs that has an HOA, and I really haven't had this issue, but I know HOAs vary in their enforcement of different rules. So people want to know, how do they respond to that HOA criticism of the weeds? And thinking of native plants as weeds and having that leaf litter that you're leaving under your trees and moving away from lawns. And he says, life-threatening crises from climate change and biodiversity loss, and this is the future of landscaping. And I like this little meme here. It says, it's not that our lawn isn't mowed, it's that we're encouraging prairie restoration. So that's how we need to think of it, right? So there's also an idea that native plantings can reduce property values. And he says not necessarily. It has to do with the design and the level of upkeep. Those things are more important than origin. And that was something that I really hadn't thought of either, but it's a great point because I'm sure we've all seen non-native landscapes that look terrible. They've got all kinds of non-native ornamentals and they just aren't kept up and it's overrun and looks bad. So it has to do with us caring for the property, giving those cues of care, rather than where the origin is of the plant. So on a small property, people will want to know, should they go for a lot of diversity or a lot of one or two types? And it really depends on what you're trying to target. So monarchs need a lot of milkweed and pollinators like masses of one type of flower. Keeping leaves on the property. This is something that, I look at most of my neighbors bag their leaves and put them on the curb. Our lawnmower munches them up, so they kind of stay, but they're munched up. Some people they have companies that take those leaf blowers and then blow them actually into the street. And I thought, gosh, that seems like a really good idea. And it wasn't until I attended something at the Water Resources recently where, that was confirmed that is a bad idea because those leaves end up in the storm water drains and they clog systems. But it's such a normal practice, something that happens constantly. I figured it had to be okay. So he says, keep those leaves on your property because it protects moisture in your soil, returns those nutrients to soil, and the tree will be starved without the return of nutrients. Some plants require, or some species require leaf litter to procreate. So if there's no leaf litter, there are no fireflies or lightning bugs. And so that makes me want to leave some leaves around because I do want to see those come back. And this mosquito fogging. So how do you convince your neighbors not to hire mosquito fogging companies? I don't think any of my own neighbors, and I keep using my neighborhood, I'm picking on my own neighborhood, but I keep using them as an example. I've never seen an actual mosquito fogging company come out and fog a yard. Today on the way to work, I was behind two separate trucks that advertised, call us to eliminate those bites, call us for mosquito fogging. We'll give you a great quote, no more bites in your yard. And he says the mosquito fogging kills every insect it encounters, not just the mosquitoes. Mosquito fogging kills the monarch butterflies, the fireflies, and all the pollinators. And just because the fogging company says the fog is made with pyrethroids, which are made from chrysanthemums, doesn't mean they're harmless. And so this was kind of a tricky little thing because I think, being someone who didn't know, if you were to be experiencing a lot of mosquito bites in your yard, and some company says we use natural products, we're using a natural plant-derived product to get mosquitoes out of your yard, you'd think, oh, that's wonderful. This could be harmless, right? And he says, no, it's not harmless. Cyanide and ricin are also natural, but they're not harmless. That's kind of a stretch, but it really kind of puts that into perspective. It does kill some mosquitoes, but not enough adults to control the population because you have to kill 90% of the population to get good control. And fogging only kills 10 to 50%. So he says mosquito dunks are a better, safer option that he recommends. And these are something that I use in my water gardens. I make sure, just do basic things like emptying standing water from areas in your yard. Those seem to be better suited. And also just using some bug repellent on your skin. I mean, it's a pain, but it's better than killing the pollinators. So something about moths. Butterflies are great, but what about moths? And I did not realize moths. I honestly have to admit to kind of ignoring moths most of my life because I didn't find them to be as pretty as butterflies. And I'm kind of ashamed to admit that. But, butterflies are cool. They're gorgeous. They're beautiful. Moths always look kind of brown or whatever. But apparently moths are really important, needless to say. For every species of butterfly, there are 19 species of moths. Most butterflies taste bad, which is why they can fly during the day, whereas moths have to fly at night. Moths are more important ecologically because they're critical components of the food web. Dan Jansen says moths and their caterpillars are the meat and potatoes of the terrestrial food web. So that is something we can't overlook right there. And something else that was brought up was, do honeybees compete with native bees? And he says honeybees are extreme generalists that can go to many different plants. And the honeybees have saturated the continental U.S. 11 and a half times. And then he says honeybees do depress native bee populations. And so, something that we may think we're doing to help by attracting more honeybees, we have to remember that we have our wild native bees that need to eat as well, and they can't eat all the things, and so there's some competition there. Just something to think about and be aware of that we may not have been aware of before. Some people point to privet flowers and say those are good sources of honey and pollen for the honeybees. Will it hurt honeybees to remove the privet? And he says privet only blooms for about a week. Bees need food for the other 51 weeks of the year, so that's a no-go. And then diseased oaks, can they be used in the landscape? And he says, yes, those oak disease spores are only spread during the years the tree is dying. Once that tree is dead, no more disease is spread, and the oak will provide valuable habitat. So springtails, millipedes, fire-colored beetles, and on and on and on he goes. You can leave a dead, fallen, or felled oak in your yard as a habitat, even if it had a disease when it was alive. So that's something to rethink. A lot of people, when they have a diseased insect or diseased tree, they want that thing gone. They want it out. So something that he said, which was, is a little harsh, but it was a point that he made, was that every time you select a non-native species over a native plant, you're deciding whether the chickadee in your yard can feed its babies or watch them starve to death because there aren't enough caterpillars. Well, okay, Doug Tallamy, put it harshly to us. So it's just something we should think of and be aware of as gardeners. I kind of like to relate it to The native plants are like our vegetables and our fruits and our seeds and our nuts and our things that we have to be healthy and be alive. And then our ornamental exotics are like our dessert, like our cake and our brownie and our ice cream. We don't want to give those things up, but we can't let those be the majority of our diet, just like we can't let those be the majority of our landscape. I don't know. What do you think about that, Heather?
I agree, and I'll use that analogy myself also. I refer to um, exotic plants like zinnias, which we
Mhm.
do see so many bees and butterflies on as like candy. They love
Mhm.
these plants, but they can't get nutrition throughout their life cycle through just the nectar.
Okay. So what would you say to a homeowner who has a mostly exotic, non-native yard? What would be the first or most important thing they could do to make it more hospitable to wildlife or to natives or just to the food web?
Yeah, we meet people where they are and suggest just incorporating a few natives into their yard, especially if it could be a keystone native that would really provide a lot of resources from just one plant, like a solidago or of course an oak, but we don't all have room for oaks, but a solidago or an aster. Um, and then also, even if you are using mostly exotics, just to chill out a bit with the pesticides, the insecticides.
Right,
That'll,
right,
you know.
right, right. So you mentioned keystone species, and that's something that I didn't define in this. Do you mind telling people what that means to be a keystone plant or keystone species and why it's important?
Sure. So keystones refer to plants that support the greatest number of beneficial insects. And it turns out that just 10% of, well, let me say it the other way, 90% of insects feed on just these few keystone species of
Hmm.
native plants. And so I can't remember how many there are, but there's less than 40 native plant
Right.
genera
Hmm.
um, that support 90% of the beneficial insects.
Okay. And you mentioned Solidago. That's goldenrod, is that correct?
That's right.
So I was surprised to read about that in the book about how, it's such an important plant for insects. But I thought to myself, I could hear myself also or hear other people saying, I'm not planting goldenrod. It takes over. It's invasive. If there's too much of it, you'll never get rid of it. What do you say about that?
That is true. There are some solidagos that do take over, but not all of them. So we have to be careful about generalizing with plants, just like people. There are probably 10 species of solidago that are quite small, less than thigh high, and they do not spread rhizomatously. And
Mhm.
so, just learn more about the plants and turn to a native plant expert to make sure you're choosing the correct species for that's garden appropriate. There are
Right.
5,000 native plants in the southeast. I only recommend about 180 of them as being appropriate for gardens.
Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of people, and probably myself included, would be afraid that some of those native plants, if you try to go all native, you're going to end up with these huge overgrown, things in your yard that you can't control or they're going to look out of place. But you're saying that if you go to someone who's kind of an expert, like, at the State Botanical Garden, you guys have your native plant sale. Isn't that in the fall?
Yes, it starts October 1st. And you're right. When I first started going nuts with natives in my yard, I absolutely planted many things that I regretted and have since removed, mostly because either they only bloom for a week out of the year and other than that they're just sprawling vegetation, or they get 12 feet tall, like, or 15, like ironweed.
Mhm.
And I've just learned which ones do well in a home garden. And then I've also learned techniques, like doing a really hard prune in early July to force them to be smaller. Um,
So do you,
so
go
sorry,
ahead.
yeah, our plant sale is October First, second, third, and fourth. The first is our Friends of the Garden preview sale, and
Okay.
the hours will be on our website.
So they would just go to what, the state botanical garden website and get all the information? Okay.
That's right.
Okay. So here's a question that you can probably weigh on as well. What's the best way to plant and propagate milkweed? I think people are particularly interested in milkweed because they want to save the monarch, which is, is very common. People kind of like a foray into native plants is the monarch butterfly. And so I have on here, the seeds are the most difficult way because many of them are infertile. They're very tiny. They have to be cold stratified. Usually deer eat them. Um, then, what would you say if somebody wants to grow a lot of milkweed in their yard, they want to propagate it, what would you recommend they do?
Yeah, I saw this and I was curious because this has not been my experience that seeds are the most difficult way.
Mhm.
Um, they're definitely not tiny. They do need cold stratification, but most wildflowers do. So I was super curious where that figure came from.
Yeah,
They're
I got the book.
they're
Yes.
easy to grow from seed
Hmm.
in my experience.
Okay.
However, here's the thing. A lot of the seeds are bad that if you just go collect them in your backyard, they are often bad. And it's not because they're tiny, they're on the big side for seeds. Um, but they just haven't been pollinated or they've been eaten by predators. But you can buy seeds online, and they germinate really well. And I think they're a pretty um, intermediate friendly wildflower to grow.
Mhm. So do you recommend people spread those seeds in the fall, or when's the best time to plant milkweed seeds?
I've had good luck sowing them even in May. And I get them from Ernst Seed Company, and their milkweed, butterfly milkweed specifically. It sort of surprised me that they did so well in May because I thought they would have needed a cold treatment, but they didn't.
Right, right.
But the way I grow them in the nursery is that we put them in cool, moist stratification. So sow them on damp potting soil and seal that up in a Ziploc bag, and in about 8 weeks bring them back out and just grow them like you grow your little vegetable starts.
Okay. So would you say if somebody wanted to propagate milkweed at home, or I've been helping my daughter's elementary school and they're trying to grow different things, and I think it'd be a fun project. Would you recommend they do butterfly weed as the easiest one, or do you think they should try swamp milkweed, or what do you recommend for like ease of starting and producing?
Swamp milkweed is the easiest, because it's not so easy to accidentally overwater, but butterfly milkweed is also quite doable as long as you're more aware of not overwatering.
Hmm.
So for kids, I might start with swamp milkweed because kids
Okay.
like to water their plants.
Oh, yeah. Oh, they do. So do you think it would be a good idea, say now, here we are in August, like if we ordered some seeds and we tried to do this at a school with like my daughter's classroom, for example, just to use an example, would we cold stratify those for like 8 weeks and then still have time to put them out for them to plant them? Or should we
Ooh,
wait?
I think we might have lost this
A
season.
window? Okay.
I would do them, in December and have them ready to put out in April.
April. Okay. Okay. That's helpful.
Yeah. I see here that you've got a picture of common milkweed, and we really worry about common milkweed in Georgia because it's not native to Georgia. We're south of its natural range. And so we're discouraging the use of common milkweed in Georgia.
Mhm.
We really encourage people to use swamp milkweed and butterfly milkweed in our state. They're just the safest bet.
I found that when I was putting this together, and because I thought I've never really seen common milkweed here, because like I mentioned, I'm from Missouri and I used to plant it there. And
That's
then it
right.
said, no, we do not want common milkweed. We're afraid it's going to become an invasive. And I was like, oh, it didn't even occur to me that a native plant would be an invasive. I know it's probably, ABC 1, 2, 3, but I just didn't think of it that way. So yeah, if you're in Georgia, don't plant the common milkweed on the left, plant the swamp milkweed on the right.
That's right.
Absolutely. Okay, and so then monarch rearing is something he addressed as well, because I know they've done this at schools, for fun and education, for conservation efforts. Let's teach the kids how to protect the monarchs by raising them. And he says that about 90% of the monarch eggs are eaten by ants before they hatch, and they must be raised in crowded conditions which are conducive to the spread of disease. Rearing them indoors hinders natural selection, and planting a lot of milkweeds is really the best way to help monarchs. So I'm assuming you agree with this, Heather, that this is a better thing to do than to buy some monarchs off the internet and try to raise them that way.
Yes, I've learned the hard way. I got some monarchs off the internet and they were so cute and growing and I was feeding them. And one morning I woke up and they all had this string, like a parachute string coming out of their bodies, and there were larvae growing all over their little
Oh
enclosure.
no, oh
And they had
no.
been parasitized. And I was glad I wasn't in a classroom with that going on.
Right, yeah. This is what not to do, right? Okay. So some people say, hey, I grow a lot of, and I've heard gardeners say this, I grow a lot of milkweeds, but the monarchs disappear when the milkweed gets big, or when the caterpillar gets big. Why is that? Where are they going? And my milkweed's not working. Talamy pointed out butterflies want to get far away from their host plant before they pupate, because their natural enemies are drawn to that host plant, and nothing's eating them. What do you say about that? Have you heard people say that, where are my monarchs with my milkweed? Why are they not sticking around?
Yeah, well, I've done it. I've had little caterpillars, not specifically a monarch, but a swallowtail caterpillar running across the yard. And I thought, oh no, he's gotten lost. And my instinct was to go put him back on the parsley. But when they're running away from their host, it's because they're ready to pupate and they're going somewhere away from it to hide. So just
Okay.
let them, they know what they're doing somehow.
Mhm. That's good to know, because I think that before learning about this, I'd be like, oh, I need to go put it back on the milkweed.
Same.
Something's
Yeah.
wrong. Right, right, right. Okay. So that's good to know. Good to learn. And then the orange and black bugs on milkweeds. They're large milkweed bugs. They're orange colored to let predators know they taste bad. And there are enough layers of milkweed seeds in pods that the bugs will not eat them all. So, because I've heard people trying to remove those bugs before they're worried they're going to, hurt their plant. But apparently, there are enough seeds. If you don't have milkweed bugs and something is wrong with your milkweed, is that correct? Or do you find that to be an issue, Heather?
Yeah, this was news to me with this book. I have been guilty of picking those milkweed bugs off and doing horrible things with them. So I'm going to change that habit too.
Okay. Okay. And then it says milkweed tussock moth can strip a milkweed, but the milkweed will still come back from the stolons. So the solution is just to have a lot of milkweed. And he did mention in here that it's good to, if you want to draw monarchs or raise monarchs or grow, protect them, don't just plant one or two milkweed. Plant like a patch of it. That's really what they need. And so that's a different way of thinking too, because I've been guilty of like planting one milkweed and thinking, oh, look at me, I've got this. I'm helping monarchs, but they really need more than that.
They need a lot. And I can't tell you how many times I've had people call needing desperate for milkweed because they have one leaf left on their milkweed plant and 10 little larvae, sitting on the
Mm-hmm.
stick looking for more food. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I would go big because you're pulling them in and then you better have enough food for them when you're doing that.
So, like the typical, home gardener in a suburban lot, how many milkweeds do you think they should have to grow like a little population of monarchs or support that population? Would you have them plant 4 or 5 plants or more
I
or
would think
less?
five. I would do five if it were me. That tends to be that's a nice odd number and that they're not big plants, so you can fit that in a typical little garden bed.
Okay. Okay. And then he had a question in the book about providing your thoughts on the use of southern, more heat-tolerant species within more northern parts of the U.S. And this is something that I've heard people talk about too, like, well, these are actually, obviously good plants to use now that we're experiencing climate change and they're doing so well. Why not just move them further and further north? And he says it's known as assisted migration when you take those southern heat-tolerant species and plant them elsewhere. But he says because of changes in the jet stream, there's an increased variability in temperatures, And when we move those plants away, they can't handle the polar vortexes, which makes sense. We want to move some of our really well-performing southern plants up further north where it's getting warmer, but they're not going to be able to handle the environment. And he also points out that moving them away from the community that is adapted to using them will leave behind those insect specialists that need them. So that's another reason not to participate in assisted migration. And this was something that surprised me too. I don't know what you probably already knew about this, but the no mow May, he said he thought it was a bad idea, good intention, bad idea. And he said, tall European turfgrass, which is what we grow, doesn't support any pollinators. And so a so-called terrible lawn that's full of dandelions and dead nettle and things in bloom that grows in May will offer lots of resources in May. And then we mow it down in June, you pull the rug out underneath them. And so to have a pollinator garden is a better alternative. He's saying no mow is no go. What do you think about that?
Um, I think I think he's maybe overemphasizing it as a bad idea. I agree it's not a solution, and the only way to benefit pollinators, but those May bloomers were gonna stop blooming anyway come
Right,
summer. They're spring annuals.
right.
So I think among all the problems we have in our yard, that's probably a smallish
Number
one.
one, right, right. If people are willing to not mow their lawns for an entire month, that's a big deal. Just like,
Yeah.
clap for that.
But I saw something really cute in my neighborhood where people mowed a um, checker grid. So, they had strips mowed, and so they just had little squares of dandelions and henbit, and I thought that was charming.
That's very cute. It seems that might be kind of difficult to do, but I like the idea. It would be really cute. Um, Something else that he brought up, and I had heard from one of our master gardeners about this, the discussion of Miyawaki forests and the potential of those microforests to get plants and animal diversity that use those plants into a degraded space much more quickly. Um, Apparently, a Miyawaki forest is just a very small, densely planted area with woody material. And this idea was created by Dr. Miyawaki after World War II because he was seeing so much of the land, desiccated, denigrated, however you want to say it, just ruined. And he felt that it was important to bring back those natural species that would go there, that would naturally without any human intervention. And so he says, the pros of that is that those Miyawaki forests, they help manage the watershed, they bring in other forms of diversity, they build community among people who are putting those in. The plant costs are low, the weeding is reduced, and the high plant diversity creates high insect diversity for a while, which is very good. And I was impressed with how quickly they could be put in. This is a picture of one that was just planted. It's basically this, small square area of densely planted little saplings, and then they can grow in very quickly, and you make your own little tiny forest without waiting for a forest to spring up naturally. Do you have any experience with this, Heather? Have you heard of it?
I had not heard of it. I think it's very charming and a really neat idea. Um, I don't think we're blessed in the South, and we have a really beautiful, tree canopy kind of throughout a lot of our suburban areas. So, I think we're in good shape with our even native tree diversity in Georgia. But
Right.
I love the idea. It
Mhm.
looks really neat.
Okay. And so this is something that I think is a big hot button too. I wanted to call this one out. Do nativars have the same ecological value as their parent species? Because an echinacea is an echinacea, right? Well, not necessarily. If you're trying to plant native, you can't necessarily plant everything that's been cultivated within that. And he points out there are 6 different traits to look at. So enhanced fall color, leaf irrigation, the change in the growth habit, disease resistance, enhanced fruiting, and the red or purple leaves. So he says that the change in the growth habit from like a tall, really tall plant to short doesn't seem to have an impact on the insects. And then making it disease resistant doesn't seem to have an impact on the insects. But getting those red and purple leaves does because it discourages them to use it. And then, so do you ever have people say, well, why can't I use like this picture here, this double delight um, echinacea or these different ones? Isn't that better than nothing? Or, what do you think about that?
Yeah, this is, you're right. I have heavily already converted native plant enthusiast audience in my
Right.
world, but this question I get all the time. Um, we are pro cultivar because we feel like if people can choose a native plant that they like that performs the way they prefer in their landscape, it is certainly better than nothing, or than an exotic plant. I so except in cases where the flower has been altered like this to be a double, or the color of the vegetation, is the red leaf thing,
Right.
we're all for them.
Okay. So kind of basically follow his rule, like, if it's a double flower or if it's red or purple, maybe don't do those, but focus on these other ones. It's better than choosing just a complete
Right.
exotic, is what you're saying.
And
Okay.
that double flower is an echinacea, which is
Mhm.
a keystone species, and the benefit of that keystone species is not in the flower, it's in the vegetation. And
Okay.
so that plant's vegetation is still going to provide a lot of resources for our leaf eaters.
Okay.
Um, I, the problem with those echinaceas is that they die within a year or two. And so, but that's a whole different problem.
Right, right, right. Okay. Well, that's good to know because I wouldn't have thought about the fact that they were valuable with their vegetation as opposed to the flower. Like even if, one thing's not good, the other one could be helpful. So
Right.
that's a good
Mhm.
point to make. And then he pointed out the Mount Cuba Center, they do research on these different cultivars to see, or nativars to see which ones can be beneficial and which ones aren't if you want to further your education on that. And then we're getting to the last few minutes, so I'll try to kind of go through these more quickly so we can get to some questions. But since most non-native plants have not become invasive, there's no harm in using most of them, true or false. And he says there are two problems with that way of thinking. They're distributed by the millions, and they represent the plant base, basically, of the region they're being used. And then if they do develop, it doesn't, even if they never develop invasive behavior, they're replacing the ecological function of the native plants, and there's no guarantee that they won't turn invasive in the future. Um, so he says without insects, we lose 90% of our flowering plants, which would cause the collapse of nature's food webs, loss of birds, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is something we all kind of, have become aware of and can accept now as gardeners or non-gardeners, people with, who live in the environment. Some notes on birds and yards. I know Kitty with the bird. I'm a cat lover, so I see that and I think it's kind of cute, Heather. Maybe I don't know if you do or not. My cats are, no, you don't. Okay. So my cats, I do keep them indoors. Thank you very much. That's something that's important to do because apparently they're huge predators of outdoor birds. It's good to feed the birds. He made a point in here too that I had heard people say, "Oh, I don't use bird feeders because I plant plants that the birds will eat." And he said that's good, but there's no way that you can provide enough plants in your yard to feed all the birds throughout the season. And probably even if you are, most of your neighbors are not. So go ahead and put up those bird feeders because you're actually helping plant the plants and use the bird feeders both. And then he says just some reasons for hopes. The artificial nesting boxes brought back the bluebirds. He mentioned that artificial ponds in a city in Switzerland brought back 9 rapidly declining species. The only one that didn't come back was one that needed a larger body of water. But just these little artificial things that we do, or these little interventions that we make, actually can make a big, big difference. Um, he says the biodiversity crisis is now part of our global discussion, which is something to be happy about. The public's realizing that we're not powerless when it comes to conservation, and we can be the ones to fix the problem, not the legislators. So Tallamy says. And so he mentions streak lawns, use keystone plants, use yellow light bulbs or amber, don't use a mosquito fogger, put beds under trees, add pollinator gardens, remove invasive species. And then he says there are sometimes municipalities have government incentives for planting native, which is something that is nice. And then for HOAs they're starting to recognize that native landscaping doesn't have to necessarily reduce the property value. And then he included this quote from Robert Swan: "The greatest threat to our planet is believing that someone else will save it." And I thought, oh, that kind of got me. I thought, okay, that's a good point. We all have a part to play in that. And he mentions too these prairie strips along farms that used to be people, it became a status symbol to have this really nice manicured green lawn at the edge of your farm field. And now they're switching back to more of these pollinator strips to welcome insects, and actually helps the crops too with pollinators and such. And get rid of your bug zapper if you've got one, no matter how fun it may be to hear those bugs zap. Yeah, so I think since we're at the end, let's go ahead and see, do we have any questions in the chat that we can address, Lisa or Jonathan?
What natives do you recommend?
So she says, what natives do you recommend? Assuming that you're a suburban property owner in Georgia and you don't want to get something that's going to go crazy and you want to fit into a yard, what do you recommend, Heather? And sources for purchasing.
Okay, so to help answer that question, the Botanical Garden has a program called the Georgia Pollinator Plants of the Year, and it's 5 years old now. And so that program has identified 4 plants a year that are really great for pollinators and really great plants in general. Each year there's a spring, summer, and fall, and then also a native plant. And those are all on our website. So that's a quick way for me to answer it without answering it. And then the other suggestion I would make would be to look at the keystone species that are on the National Wildlife Federation's website, and those have been identified by Doug Tallamy. And so choosing the keystone species, particularly I think for gardeners, the keystone perennials, because that's something you really have space for in a garden, will let you have the most impact.
And aside from your plant sale that you're having in October, where do you recommend people source these things? Because we don't all live next to like a native nursery, or maybe Athens is not, close enough for some people. What do you recommend?
So we have a really complete list of recommendations for native plant nurseries also on our website. I think it's probably under the conservation tab. But you could also probably Google State Botanical Garden recommended nurseries. And that's got a really great list. And that is a nice list because we've vetted that they don't sell invasive species or plants treated with systemic pesticides.
Okay, perfect. Another question, Lisa?
Milkweed a perennial or
Okay, so somebody wants to know if a milkweed is a perennial or a reseeder.
It's a perennial.
Yeah. Okay, another question?
Hydrangea has black spots. Is this caused from the rain? And multiple flowers did not bloom this year.
Okay, that was okay.
Because I cut them back.
Okay, that's more of a not a native. Somebody asked about their hydrangeas having black spots. Listen, my hydrangeas on the northern side of my house have black spots too. It's from all the rain and all the moisture, and yeah, it's just a part of living in the wet region we're in right now. Do we have any more native questions we could ask Heather?
Last call. No.
No. Okay. And anybody here in the room have any questions for Heather? Yes.
Yeah. Talk about the mosquito foggers. There's lawn service companies that have a different process where I think it's liquid, for mosquito repellents. Is that just as bad or is that better?
So he's asking about mosquito repellent, and some lawn companies will use a liquid instead of fogging. And is that better for the plants and insects? Do you happen to know, Heather, or?
I have heard from entomologists that it is not better. It's an insecticide is an insecticide, and unless they're those mosquito dunks that you put in standing water, those are considered safe for a lot of other insects. But other than that, yeah, it's a no-go. And also it only works for about 24 hours. You're not able to build a fence around your property. So
Right.
yeah, I think off or a fan on your patio.
Right. Fans do help. Yeah, they do. There used to be an off fan. I don't know if they make it anymore, but it was like a little clip-on fan and it had like glue around yeah. Mine always fell off, but I liked it. Okay. We have a few more questions. Yes. Oh, sorry.
We discussed the impact of lighting on insects, and we can control our own property. But what about, the street lights? Are those
So Heather, we have a question and you can weigh in on this too. He's talking about, we can control the lights on our own property, but what about, municipal lights, street lights and different lights? What do we do about those? Do you have any insight into that? I don't know.
I I have been paying attention to this because I was horrified by those statistics about artificial lighting. I don't know, but I have not seen a lot of moths messing around with street lights. And so I wonder if it is a better wavelength or something.
Yeah,
But
I don't.
hey, this thing, like we need to spread the word about the lights because when there's such a simple solution, it's really
Right.
a shame not to be executing it.
I don't want to put Becky Griffin on blast, but she did say on one of her one of her talks. So she did say this. She said that she's been known to go turn off neighbors' lights or actually unscrew their bulbs. She said that cracked me up. I thought, well, okay, you put it out there, Becky. I'm not gonna, you're the one who said it. So I don't know if I'd recommend that. But did you have a question, ma'am?
I did. I'm getting mixed information about cornflowers. Now,
Okay.
I see it's a keystone, or I hear it's a keystone,
Mhm.
but I've also heard that it's non-native.
Okay, so she's asking about coneflower. She says she's heard that she's getting mixed information that it's a keystone plant, but then also that it's non-native. I guess that has to do with the nativars, Heather, do you think, or can you address that?
No, this is whoever asked that question is savvy and educated. They are barely native to Georgia. They're native only in a few counties in Northwest Georgia. Um, so you're right. I think I might be busted, but they are a little bit native to Georgia.
A little bit native works for me.
Right. So, I mean, do you think that's okay? Like, do we need to be drilling down into those, like, what's native to this particular pocket of the state, or is it okay just to pick a native that's not an exotic, or, how important is that?
In general, I do try to really encourage using plants that are not only native to Georgia, but native to the physiographic province where you're planting them. I'm not super dogmatic about it. I feel like um, I like to make this as accessible as possible to
Right.
people. And so I think I turned a little bit of a blind eye to the fact that echinacea doesn't naturally occur in our area.
Okay. Any other questions here in the room? Yes.
Every year I plant sunflower in my garden.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good idea?
So we have a lady asking, she says that every year she plants sunflowers in her garden and she wants to know if that's a good idea. I would say still absolutely yes, but what do you think, Heather?
I think if you love them, that it sounds absolutely harmless and like a joyful thing to do. They don't take up much space and they definitely don't do any harm. Just know that, they're not providing a huge number of ecosystem services, but I think Dr. Tallamy would agree. And I know birds eat the seeds.
I was going to say when he talks about, and maybe I'm getting this mixed up, but he's talking more about like the insects that can use it, but birds use them quite well, right? So
Yeah.
so that's and they're part of the ecosystem as well. It's just that birds also need so many caterpillars. Who knew they needed so many caterpillars and things that we have to make sure we're providing that as well. So it's kind of just like that. You can have cake and you can have your candy and you can have you can have your whatever, but you got to make sure you get your fruits and veggies in too. So okay. Do we have any more questions in the room or on the chat?
Put mosquito pod in your bird bath. Someone said I could, but I wasn't too sure about that.
Okay. They want to know if you can put the mosquito pod in their bird bath, and they weren't sure if it was safe or not. I believe that you can. I think they say they're safe for bird baths. This BT, yeah.
Bird baths.
Okay.
Even livestock cistern.
All right. Okay.
BT. It's
And so, Heather, I just want to say thank you so much for spending your time. You spent over an hour with us. I know you're busy, you have other things to do. I really, really appreciate you sitting here and listening to me blab on about the things I found in the book. So, and
I
answering our
learned some
questions.
things.
Okay,
Thank you
okay.
for having me.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And if that's it, everybody, we'll go ahead and say goodbye. Thank you all for being here, and please register on our website for more classes at the Extension Gwinnett website, and then go to the State Botanical Garden of Georgia website, because that's where Heather has links for their plant sale they're having and other things too. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Yeah, BT is a naturally occurring bacteria that